Welcome to Shadow Talk, a cybersecurity podcast powered by ReliaQuest, the leader in agentic AI security operations. I'm Tehman Tariq, Senior Manager of Gray Matter Operations.
And I'm John Dilgen, Cyber Threat Intelligence Analyst. And today is the second part in our series covering ReliaQuest's annual threat report for 2026. Last week, we looked at initial access. And this week, we're looking past initial access into what happens after. Specifically, we're looking at the changes in the threat landscape around privilege escalation, ransomware, and exfiltration.
John, as I've been reading through the annual threat report, there's one trend that really stuck out to me, and it has to do with impact.
I think I know what you're talking about there, Tehman, because it really struck me too. So I think what you're discussing is the breakdown between the amount of incidents we saw with exfiltration versus the amount we saw with encryption.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that the majority of incidents that we saw were involved with exfiltration with no signs of encryption. To break this down further, 79% of incidents involved some level of data exfiltration, whereas only 28% involved encryption.
That's a really important stat, and it really shows threat actor focus, as threat actors are valuing the fastest means to extort an organization first. They still value encryption, but exfiltration is their first step in that goal.
So the majority of attacks show exfiltration simply because that's the fastest goal an attacker can achieve.
Exactly right. And another factor too is that the data capture and exfiltration, it's much less likely to be detected when compared to something that's very noisy like encryption. So it's fast and it's more likely to get past defenses.
And I'm betting most organizations still aren't optimized correctly for the double extortion model of both fast exfiltration and encryption. So on this episode, we'll further break down those gaps and what organizations can do about it. John, like we introduced last week, please break down the key takeaways from this episode so that our listeners with limited time can understand the major topics and points.
Yeah, absolutely. So here are the key points we're going to get to later in the episode. First, the speed of attackers. So last week we saw that attackers are much faster in that time between initial access and lateral movement, what we call the breakout time, averaging at 34 minutes with the fastest at 4 minutes. But we're breaking down this week is going to be around exfiltration. And the fastest time we saw to exfiltration in 2025 was 6 minutes, with the fastest time to encryption being 19 minutes. Another worrying stat around that is that exfiltration is becoming more difficult to detect, as 42% of exfiltration now uses legitimate platforms like OneDrive, GitHub, and Dropbox. Additionally, privilege escalation techniques actually declined 15% in 2025. And this might sound good, but the reality is that attackers are starting with higher privilege credentials during initial access, many of which are harvested through social engineering and sold on criminal marketplaces on the dark web. Overall, as attacks become faster, it's important for organizations to prioritize speed of detection and the ability to detect at source or in transit. Additionally, as attacks continue to be harder to detect, it's important to have contextual holistic behavioral analysis really supported by something like AI that can analyze behavioral analytics across multiple incidents, providing high-level context into what's happening in your environment. And finally, predictive analysis through dark web monitoring is really needed to catch those social engineering attacks and the high privilege credentials for sale that attackers are grabbing before the attack.
Perfect. Thank you for the overview, John. And now can you also walk us through the top threats of 2025 and how the landscape has changed?
Absolutely. So let's start by examining the breakdown of incidents involving exfiltration versus encryption. So to restate what we introed, 79% of incidents we saw in the ATR involve exfiltration compared to just 28% involving encryption. So what's actually happening here? And what does this data actually tell us? Well, the data isn't saying that ransomware groups no longer value encryption. What it's saying is that the first thing these groups value is exfiltration and data capture, because that's the fastest goal they can achieve on objective.
So the majority of attacks show exfiltration simply because that's the fastest impact an attacker can have to help guarantee themselves an extortion payment.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's kind of like the discussion we broke down in one of our recent Shadow Talk episodes, where we discussed the difference in operating models between groups that focus on exfiltration only versus exfiltration and encryption. And the key thing here is that attackers still value encryption. Exfiltration and data capture just comes faster. And to restate here, the fastest exfiltration time we saw was 6 minutes, and the fastest encryption time we saw was 19 minutes. And there's another important factor that really drives the exfiltration first strategies. And as I mentioned, they're harder to detect compared to a noisy process like encrypting an entire network. Here's another interesting stat from our ATR that supports this. 42% of exfiltration now uses platforms like OneDrive, GitHub, and Dropbox. This is a technique evolution that is challenging because it takes advantage of platforms with legitimate use cases. OneDrive and Dropbox are commonly used by everyday users, so they're very difficult to block through access controls. And they're difficult to detect because there's no outbound traffic to a malicious domain. There were three major factors that really defined the threat landscape. The first is that the ransomware ecosystem hit a record fragmentation. There was a total of 84 active groups at its peak volume. And that volume really reinforces why predicting future attacks based off of group names like Lockbit or Akira can be a losing battle. However, predictions at a higher level by TTPs or tactics are critical to defense. Second, detection windows are closing for the fastest attacks. If exfiltration happens in 6 minutes and your SIM takes hours to ingest and analyze logs, you're losing the cybersecurity race for speed.
And John, to be clear there, this isn't a tool problem or like a staffing problem. It's an architecture problem where batch processing can't keep pace with some of those real-time attacks.
Yeah, that's exactly true, Tehman. It's really the sheer volume of logs that organizations have to deal with that slows down their time to detection. And taking it back, the final major element of the threat landscape in 2025 was that attackers are consistently finding ways to bypass individual detections and tools. So a really good example of this is how the attackers are using OneDrive for exfiltration. And let's play a scenario. Previously, an alert for a large data upload to a suspicious domain would have successfully caught exfiltration. Well, now this activity blends in with the daily activity of your standard users. So what's really needed here is some type of holistic analysis across multiple detections in the attack lifecycle. This analysis can be assisted with something like AI to understand the context behind an action. So instead of just seeing one alert on an upload to a suspicious domain, we can now see the lateral movement, the unauthorized access of files, all that taken into context with a standard OneDrive upload, which now becomes our alerting point, even though the attackers have evolved their tactics past that single point. All right, Tehman, that's enough talking for me. I'm going to pass it over to you. So based on our ATR, what do you think some of the biggest challenges to organizations right now are?
So overall, the underlying message is that attackers are consistently getting more difficult to detect with just single detections. 2025 was defined by about three key elements. The first one is attackers arriving with pre-escalated credentials. The second one is attackers working to blind defenders to their own standard logging sources. And then the final one is attackers using living off the land tools to blend in with legitimate user activity. So I'm going to start with that first one, like attackers arriving pre-escalated. So privilege escalation techniques declined about 15% year over year. That sounds like good news until you realize the why. Attackers don't need to escalate as much. They're starting initial access with high-level credentials, not escalating post-access. Often, these credentials are stolen through domains that impersonate the organization and then are sold on the dark web to the highest bidder. So when an escalation does happen, threat actors are modifying existing accounts. They're not creating new ones. Account manipulation jumped to 31%. That generates logs identical to legitimate IT operations.
And so, Tehman, what you're really breaking down here is two more examples of how attackers are bypassing single detection mechanisms within privilege escalation itself.
Right. And now let's talk about like why they're bypassing an entire defensive tool altogether. Defense impairment or attackers hindering or disabling defensive mechanisms increased from 17% in 2024 to 21% in 2025. And 55% of those incidents specifically targeted EDR agents. So let's stop and think about that for a moment and what that means operationally. In organizations where EDR is the primary visibility source, disabling the agent creates a detection blind spot. One documented case showed attackers disabling Microsoft Defender, deploying credential theft tools, and then clearing over 1,000 PowerShell logs all in under an hour.
And Tehman, I'm going to jump in here because what you just defined of threat actors being able to disable EDR is also something we saw in our report analyzing ransomware success. And what we saw was one of the key defining factors around ransomware success was whether or not they offered their affiliates advanced tools, specifically those that disabled EDRs. And so it really is a key element in a ransomware group's overall strategy.
Exactly. Next, lateral movement is dominated by legitimate tools. 24% of incidents used RDP, 16% SMB, and then 10% using SSH. All standard protocols commonly used within many organizations. Detections require distinguishing malicious activity from legitimate admin work with holistic behavioral analytics that can group multiple patterns or malicious behavior or alerts across those different incidents, such as impossible travel, unusual access patterns, and then abnormal command execution attempts. So if attackers are prioritizing the fastest method to extortion and they're becoming harder to detect, where does that leave our defenses and what actually works? That's what we're going to dig into after the break.
Shadow Talk is brought to you by ReliaQuest, the global leader in AI cybersecurity. ReliaQuest helps enterprise cybersecurity teams contain threats in minutes with its agentic AI security operations platform, Gray Matter. ReliaQuest makes security possible for the most trusted enterprise brands in the world. Learn more at ReliaQuest.com.
And we're back. Before the break, we laid out the problem. Detection architecture built for hours to respond can't stop attacks that operate within just a few minutes. Let's talk about what that actually means to close that gap. So one of the first kind of discussion topics that I'll be having with John is like the speed problem is an architecture problem. Let's start with that 6-minute exfiltration. As we mentioned, the exfiltration itself is becoming harder to detect. I have a two-part question here. First, what are the tools that organizations can use to detect this type of activity? And the second one is, how do they architect these tools to ensure they can keep up with the speed at which attackers are moving?
All right, so let's address the first part of that question. There are a few tools that can be used to defend this type of activity. Number one is going to be data loss prevention or DLP tools. And this allows you to inspect the files, specifically the access and the upload attempts in real time to determine if a user is authorized to access that type of data and put a block in place if they're not. The next one is going to be cloud access security brokers or CASBs. And these tools can look into the software as a service uploads as they happen, essentially sitting between your users in tools like OneDrive or GitHub. They inspect the content as it flows and can also block based on alerting policies your organization has set up. And the final one is behavioral monitoring of file access, specifically looking for bulk upload and access patterns. If an attacker accesses 10,000 files within 2 minutes, that's something this kind of tool can do really well.
John, it sounds like a lot of those tools already exist today. So what's stopping organizations from utilizing those tools and stopping the attacks that we're already seeing?
Yeah, that's exactly true. Those tools are really nothing new, but there are two major pieces of that puzzle that stops the organizations from using them correctly. Number one is proper configuration of these tools. And number two has to do with the speed at which the tools can alert. So first, let's talk about proper configuration. Tools like DLP, cloud access, and behavioral monitoring really work off of understanding normal activity to identify the abnormal activity. And that requires a significant amount of fine-tuning in these tools to prevent large volumes of false positives. And the harsh reality here is that most teams are so buried by the reactive work responding to the sheer volume of alerts they have that they don't have time to fine-tune these tools. So for a lot of these tools to be configured properly, organizations really need to break free from the reactive tier 1 and tier 2 work that they're doing and free up their team's time, really allowing them to conduct the tuning and reviews that these tools require to be effective detection mechanisms. The second element that's holding organizations back is the speed to which they can alert. As we've laid out, most organizations have a severe delay between the time a security log is written and the time that it can be used in a detection. And this is caused by the volume of logs organizations need to process every day. These logs are funneled through a traditional path, directly into their SIEM, at which point an alert can fire. But this takes hours on average versus exfiltration now happening in minutes. So many organizations just can't compete in that race. In order to win, you need to be able to detect as fast as the data moves, ideally detecting its source on the device that is firing the log, or in transit as that data is moving from its source to its storage. And this allows you to get the fastest detection and containment time possible, preventing exfiltration and further impact. All right, Tehman, so we've mentioned that the threats are getting harder to detect, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for organizations to rely on a single alert through a single technology. A great reminder of this is that stat we highlighted, that 55% of defense impairment is targeting EDRs. So my question is, if organizations can't rely on a single log source, on a single alert, how do they defend themselves?
Yep. And there's really two pieces that need to work together there. The first one is defense in depth, and the other is holistic analysis across alerts and tools. So we're going to start with defense in depth. Obviously, we know that this isn't new, right? It's been the standard. Stack as many different alerts through as many different tools as you can into your defense to ensure you have that redundancy. So if one becomes available or is compromised, you still have that other redundancy and that other protection. But the important piece is that I think many organizations are still behind on this, is ensuring that when alerts do fire, context is quickly taken across the entire tech stack to get a correct picture of the activity rather than just a silo of a small portion of what occurred. That statistic that you mentioned earlier, that 55% of defense impairment is targeting EDRs, let's break that down into another scenario. So if a threat actor compromises a device and disables the EDR, then one of the best tools for detecting malicious activity on an endpoint no longer has the visibility or the logging to fire critical alerts. But that doesn't disable all of our detections across the entire kill chain. It just inhibits our specific visibility on it. So an EDR may have fired a critical alert, which isn't possible once it's been disabled. However, we still might have additional detections for lateral movement and for suspicious command execution. So that holistic analysis across those detections can see the context behind the two different alerts, even though it lacks the severity of the EDR alert. And this allows us to be independent of single tools and alerts as much as possible.
And that whole holistic analysis that you're mentioning, it's really a great use case for AI because it's able to piece together the context across the alerts and the tools, and it can do so much faster than your average human.
Right. And this is another piece that I wanted to highlight as well. Being able to detect log gaps. If a system stops sending expected logs, like an EDR heartbeat, for example, or you're no longer seeing those Windows event logs, that absence is itself a detection signal. Hosts no longer reporting the same log volume they do normally is additional context for analysis, despite the lack of EDR visibility.
All right. So rounding out our third point here, Tehman, we spoke earlier about how attackers are arriving with higher privilege credentials to facilitate initial access, rather than needing to escalate their privileges during the attack. So can you break down how attackers are getting these credentials and what organizations can do to defend against it?
Absolutely. So attackers are really using social engineering to steal those credentials. They spin up a domain that impersonates the organization they want to target. And from there, they convince the user either through phishing or phone calls to navigate to that link and enter their credentials. For years, we've seen Scattered Spider create mirrored domains. They look very similar to the one that the legitimate organizations use. And even more recently, we've seen Shiny Hunters do something very similar, where they're spinning up these similar domains, but instead of delivering them directly through like email, for example, they're calling the user directly and having them navigate to the domain. So it's taking that technology piece out of it, of just like that human trust, and actually going even closer to the human by having them interact with it directly. And they have that trust that's already built because they feel like they're talking to a known and authorized source. What's critical here is that they start by targeting high value users such as CFOs or IT admins to capture their credentials. In a similar fashion, like we mentioned last week, we're seeing malware like Bowloader impersonate software commonly used by IT administrators to deploy information stealing malware.
And Tehman, I'm going to cut in here just to underline a critical point. And really, the key thing here is that they're stealing credentials for high value users, specifically those IT administrators, the CFOs. That's where they're starting out.
Exactly, John. That's really crucial for our listeners to understand. Once those high value credentials are captured, they're used to facilitate campaigns or sold to the highest bidder on the dark web. A lot of these criminal marketplaces, such as Russian Market, allow threat actors to purchase credentials for the domain or organizations of their choosing. Those are the threats, but the second part of your question was, how do organizations defend against them? And what's really needed here is some sort of digital risk monitoring that can analyze recently created domains to find and start blocking those proactively, as well as those phishing sites that are masquerading your organization, or alert to those exposed credentials on the dark web to ensure that they can be remediated well before they are used. True resilience is about building a defense that operates ahead of the threats. Detection architectures where speed matches the threat, visibility that survives attacker interference, and monitoring that reaches into the dark web before stolen credentials become your next breach. Now I'm going to have a few different kind of key takeaways for CISOs that I want everyone to learn, especially if you're a security leader. This comes down to 3 strategic pivots. First, your board needs to understand that ransomware is no longer primarily only an encryption problem. 79% of impact has been exfiltration, and that exfiltration is faster than ever. Your defensive strategy needs to be centered around speed. How fast can you stop the attacker? The second one is budget reallocation. If your security spending is still weighed towards reactive alert response, then it's misaligned with where that threat actually lives. What wins today is AI-driven holistic analysis. The ability to correlate behavioral signals across your entire environment and surface that context that no single alert could by itself. That's where investment needs to go. Not just more tools, but the analytical layer that makes every tool smarter and much faster. And then the final one is the architectural and strategic assessment. If your detection architecture requires hours to ingest and analyze logs, you're structurally incapable of stopping the fastest attacks. And if your threat intelligence program isn't monitoring the dark web for impersonating domains and exposed credentials, you're waiting to react to attacks that could have been predicted. Speed and foresight have to work together here. The kind of call to action for leaders is tomorrow morning, pull your last ransomware tabletop exercise or your instant response plan and ask one single question. If an attacker exfiltrated our most sensitive data in 6 minutes using OneDrive, would this plan catch it? If the answer is no, or if nobody's certain, then you've just identified your highest priority architecture gap. That will be your starting point.
Great recommendations there, Tehman. I'm going to break it down for the defenders in a similar fashion. So on the practitioner side, start with the visibility that survives defense impairment. If your EDR is your only visibility source, you're one disabled agent away from going blind. And this holds true for all your devices across the network. You might have multiple log sources deployed across your entire network stack. But how many of those are applied to every single endpoint, every single server? Specifically look for those gaps to find the weak points that attackers will exploit. Next, for privileged access, the threat starts before the attacker is even in your environment. Monitor for newly registered domains impersonating your organization, and implement dark web monitoring to detect exposed credentials before they're weaponized. If a high-value account's credentials are listed on a criminal marketplace, that's an incident waiting to happen, and one that you can get ahead of. So first thing tomorrow morning, ask yourself one thing. What happens if your EDR agent stops logging on a critical host right now? Do you still get authentication logs, network connection logs, PowerShell transcripts? If the answer is no, then that's your blind spot. Start with all your critical hosts and ensure that you have redundant logging enabled around them.
And to close this out, detection tools won the last war, but attackers stopped being loud. They now arrive pre-armed with already bought credentials. They move through those platforms that you already trust, and now they're able to exfiltrate in just a matter of minutes. Defenders who don't adjust are solving for a threat that attackers have already moved well past. The new edge is being predictive, and it starts before the breach. That's all for this week's episode. Thanks for listening to another episode of Shadow Talk. If you'd like to get in touch, we're just an email away. You can send your questions to shadowtalk@reliaquest.com. Please don't forget to subscribe so you can get our next week's episode delivered direct to your podcasting platform of choice. And we really appreciate if you can rate and review Shadow Talk wherever you listen. It will make a huge difference and help us reach new listeners. We'll be back next week with another episode of Shadow Talk.